My name is Natalie Brooks, and I'm 28 years old. For 3 years, I loved a man who slowly trained me to feel grateful for scraps. People always imagine the end of a relationship as one explosive fight, one betrayal so obvious it splits everything in half. That wasn't what happened to me. What happened was quieter, smaller, meaner. It lived in sighs, eye rolls, interruptions, and the constant feeling that wanting ordinary tenderness somehow made me difficult. His name was Mason Reed. For a long time, I kept giving him the benefit of the doubt. First, I told myself he was stressed. Then I told myself every couple went through rough seasons. By the third year, I had become so used to adjusting around his moods that I could predict exactly when he was about to make me feel foolish for speaking. That was the worst part. Not that he changed. It was that I adapted. We had been living together for a year and a half, and by the end, our apartment no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place where I managed everything and hoped not to be resented for existing. I cooked, cleaned, handled the landlord, remembered the bills, fixed the small problems, and softened every sharp edge of daily life before he ever had to notice it. In return, Mason gave me the kind of contempt that was easy to dismiss if you only looked at one moment at a time. One rude comment was nothing. One irritated glance was nothing. One sarcastic laugh was nothing. But stack enough nothings together, and eventually they become your life. 2 months before I left, I made dinner on a Thursday night. Nothing fancy, just grilled salmon, quinoa salad, and lemon, the way he used to like it. I even lit the small candle near the sink because I missed what dinner together had once felt like. I missed that version of us so badly that sometimes I cooked for it like grief could be fed and brought back to life. Mason came home, dropped his bag by the door, looked at the table, and made a face. "Ugh," he said, "this again?" I stood there holding the serving spoon. "You used to love this meal." He gave a short laugh without looking at me. "Yeah, when I was basic. My taste has evolved." My hand tightened around the spoon. "Okay, what would you rather have?" He was already scrolling on his phone. "I don't know. Figure it out. You're the one obsessed with these lame dinner dates." Lame. That word stayed with me longer than the rest of the conversation. It wasn't dramatic enough to justify leaving over. It wasn't cruel enough to spark a big scene. It was just humiliating enough to sink under my skin and stay there. I set the spoon down carefully because I suddenly didn't trust my hands. "If you don't want to eat together, you can just say that." He didn't even look up. "Whatever, I'll order something." That had become our pattern. I tried, he dismissed. I reached, he acted inconvenienced. I spoke, and he made me feel dramatic for noticing what was right in front of me. The ugliest part was that I had started expecting it. About a month before that dinner, I had gone to my friend Dante's place to help him move. The apartment was full of boxes, half-packed shelves, bad speaker audio, and takeout containers on the counter. It should have felt messy. Instead, it felt light. There were people in and out all afternoon. Dante's friend Caleb helped carry furniture. Another couple from our hiking group dropped by with coffee. At one point, we all ended up sitting on the floor, sweaty and tired, laughing over cheap noodles. Nothing extraordinary happened that day. That was exactly why it stayed with me. Nobody mocked anyone for talking too long. Nobody made affection feel embarrassing. Nobody punished anyone else for taking up space. People interrupted, joked, argued over where the couch should go, then laughed and fixed it together. It felt easy, real, normal. I drove home that night and found Mason stretched out on the couch, TV glowing blue across his face. He barely looked at me. "Can you not stomp around?" he muttered. "I'm trying to watch this." I stood there with my keys in my hand, still carrying the easy warmth of Dante's apartment. And in that stupid, ordinary moment, something inside me went cold. Because suddenly I knew the difference. I knew what normal felt like. And once you know, it becomes harder to keep calling misery love. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't cry. I didn't beg him to care. I just went into the bathroom, shut the door, and stared at myself in the mirror. I looked tired, not heartbroken, not hysterical, just tired in a way that felt older than 28. That was the night I stopped trying to save us. Quietly, I started building a way out. At first, it was small. I looked at apartment listings during lunch breaks. I cut back on things I didn't need and started saving. I stopped planning special evenings for someone who treated my effort like a joke. I stopped asking him to join me for coffee, for walks, for anything that required him to act like my boyfriend instead of a man barely tolerating my presence. I matched his energy. He wanted distance? Fine. He wanted silence? Fine. He wanted a relationship where two people split rent and little else? Fine. The strange thing was, he barely noticed. Or maybe he noticed and assumed I would never actually leave. People get careless when they think your love has nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, mine was slowly coming back to me. I started seeing Dante more again. I returned to a couple of hiking meetups I had skipped because Mason always acted annoyed when I left him alone on weekends. I laughed more. Not in some dramatic transformation, just enough to remember that I still could. Mason, on the other hand, stayed exactly who he had become. He still went out with Bianca, whose entire personality seemed built around sarcasm. He still acted like basic adult responsibility was beneath him, and every time something broke, needed attention, or required a 5-minute phone call, it somehow became my job. Then, last week, the dishwasher broke again. Water crept across the kitchen floor while I stood there with a towel in one hand and said into the living room, "Can you call the landlord this time? I handled it the last 3 times." He didn't pause the show he was watching. "Why is that my job?" I stared at him. "Because you live here too." "I don't have time for this, Natalie." "It's a phone call, Mason." That got his attention just enough to annoy him. He muted the TV and looked at me like I was interrupting something important. "God, you've been so needy lately. What is your deal?" For a second, I almost laughed. Because it was almost elegant, the way he had turned basic partnership into a flaw in me. "My deal," I said calmly, "is that you treat me like I'm inconvenient." He leaned back and exhaled hard. "Oh my God, here we go." "I'm serious." "You always do this," he snapped. "You act like some victim because I don't respond exactly how you want." My heartbeat was loud in my throat, but my voice stayed steady. "You roll your eyes when I talk. You mock the things I do for us. You act like spending time with me is a chore." He threw one hand in the air, already bored. Fine. If you don't like it, find someone else." There it was. So casual. So arrogant. He said it like a man absolutely certain I would flinch first. Instead, I felt something terrifyingly close to peace. Because the sentence that was supposed to scare me only confirmed what I had already decided. I set the towel down on the counter. Then I said, "Already did." He blinked. "What?" "I already did," I repeated. "I found somewhere else. I signed the lease last week. I'm moving out." For the first time in months, Mason looked directly at me. Not with guilt, not with love, with disbelief, as if the furniture had suddenly answered back. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that movers are coming next Saturday." His expression changed in stages. Confusion, offense, then anger rushing in to cover the panic underneath. "You signed a lease without telling me?" I held his stare. "You told me to find someone else. I took the advice." "That's not what I meant." "Then maybe you should say what you mean." He stood so fast the couch shifted behind him. "You can't just leave." And that was the moment I knew he still didn't understand. Not me, not what he had done. Not what it cost to be dismissed one day at a time until love turns into clarity. He kept staring at me like I had spoken in another language. "You're being ridiculous," he said at last, but his voice had changed, thinner now, less certain. "You're seriously moving out over one argument?" I almost smiled. That was how people like him survive themselves. They shrank everything down until your pain looked irrational and their cruelty looked harmless. It wasn't months of contempt. It was one argument. It wasn't the 1,000 humiliations that had taught me to make myself smaller in my own home. It was me, suddenly overreacting, as if this had all appeared out of nowhere. "No," I said. "I'm moving out over who you've been for a long time." His jaw tightened. "So that's it? 3 years and you just decide I'm the villain now?" "I didn't decide anything," I said. "I just stopped pretending this was normal." He laughed once. "Wow, dramatic." I let that word die where it landed, then crossed to the drawer beside the microwave and pulled out the folder I had been keeping there. I slid it across the counter. He frowned. "What's that?" "Details." Inside were the lease transfer papers, the landlord emails, confirmation that my name would be removed once the replacement tenant signed, and the receipt for the deposit on my new studio. His eyes moved faster the deeper he got into the paperwork. "You did all this already?" "Yes." "When?" "Over the last 6 weeks." He looked up sharply. 6 weeks? I nodded. That number seemed to hit him even harder than the fact that I was leaving. 6 weeks meant planning. Intention. It meant I had been living beside him, answering his cold questions, washing the dishes, managing the apartment, all while quietly choosing a life that no longer included him. And what offended him most was not that I had been hurting. It was that I had made decisions without his permission. "You've been lying to me for 6 weeks," he said. I gave a small, tired laugh. "Lying? Mason, you haven't asked me a real question in months." His face darkened. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Twist this around." If you were unhappy, you should have said something. I stared at him. Then I said very evenly, I did. I did. I told him when he mocked the dinner I made. I told him when he rolled his eyes while I was talking. I told him when I felt lonely in the same room with him. I told him when I asked for one intentional night together. I even asked him once if he still liked me. Every time, the answer had been some version of the same thing. I was too sensitive, too heavy, too needy, too exhausting. Men like Mason never remember your pain once they've decided it's inconvenient. He threw the papers back down. So, who is it? I frowned. Who is what? The person, he snapped. The someone else. Who is he? There isn't another man, I said. He narrowed his eyes like he didn't believe me. Like the only explanation for a woman leaving him had to be another man somewhere in the frame. I found somewhere else to live, I said. That's what I meant. He looked unconvinced. And who's taking over your half of the lease? A friend of Dante's. Male or female? Male. That seemed to satisfy him for half a second before suspicion returned. What friend? His name is Caleb. Mason's expression shifted. He had met Caleb once, briefly, at Dante's birthday, enough to remember him. Caleb had that easy kind of presence some people are born with. Not loud, not showy, just steady. The kind of man who listened when other people talked. The kind who asked follow-up questions because he actually cared about the answers. In other words, exactly the kind of man Mason liked to perform in public and rarely managed to be in private. That guy, he said, he's moving in here? Yes. Why? Because he needs a place. I'm leaving, and the landlord approved him yesterday. Mason stared at me, then let out a humorless laugh. Of course. He stepped closer, voice sharpening. You've been planning some little exit strategy with Dante and his friends behind my back, and now you're moving in Captain Personality to prove a point? I kept my face still. Caleb is taking over my half of the lease. That's the point. You expect me to believe that's all this is? Yes, I said, because that's all this is. There it was again. His refusal to accept a reality that didn't flatter him. If another man existed anywhere near the situation, then surely it had to be emotional betrayal. He preferred that version because it made him the injured one. The truth was less flattering. The truth was that I had simply reached my limit. You know what's convenient? I asked quietly. The way you suddenly care now that leaving affects you. He looked genuinely stunned, so I kept going. You didn't care when I ate dinner alone because you were too annoyed to sit at the table. You didn't care when I handled every apartment problem because you couldn't be bothered. You didn't care when I stopped laughing as much or talking as much or asking you for anything at all. But now that rent and logistics and your comfort are involved, suddenly this is serious. It's not about comfort, he shot back. No? I asked. Then what is it about? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That silence told the truth for him. He wasn't heartbroken. Not really. He was destabilized. There's a difference. Heartbreak mourns the person. Destabilization mourns the arrangement. And Mason, for all his anger and disbelief, sounded more like a man upset that his routine had been interrupted than a man devastated by losing someone he loved well. Finally, he ran a hand through his hair and said, When is this guy coming to see the place? Saturday, I said. With Dante? Yes. He gave a low scoff. I looked at him and said, What's unbelievable isn't that I'm leaving. It's how shocked you are that I finally believed what you kept showing me. That night, after he shut himself in the living room and started slamming cabinets just to make sure I could hear him, I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hand and stared at a message from Dante. You okay? I read it 3 times before answering. Yeah, he knows. The typing bubble appeared almost immediately. Want me there Saturday? I smiled for the first time all day. Yes. Then another message came through. Caleb too, we'll make it fast. I looked around the room I had shared with a man who could no longer imagine me outside the role he had assigned me. The dresser we had picked out together. The lamp I bought because he said overhead lighting was depressing. The framed print above the bed that he once said made the room feel grown up, though I had been the one to choose it, hang it, and dust it. So much of this life had been built by my hands and then treated as if it had assembled itself. I typed back, Thank you. Then, after a second, I'm really leaving this time. Dante's reply came instantly. Good. I stared at that word longer than I expected to. Not because it was harsh. Because it wasn't. It was honest. And honesty, I was starting to realize, can feel a lot like oxygen after years of breathing around someone else's moods. Saturday arrived under gray light and a silence that felt temporary, as if the apartment itself knew something was about to be broken apart. I had been awake for an hour before Mason came out of the living room. He looked like he hadn't slept. He moved too quickly in some moments and too slowly in others, as if his body couldn't decide whether to fight or pretend none of this was happening. I was taping up another box when he stopped in the doorway and said, "So this is really happening?" "Yes." He leaned one shoulder against the frame and watched me pack. Normal people at least try to fix things before they blow up their lives. I closed the box and stood. Normal people don't mock their partners for asking for basic respect. "There you go again," he said, making me sound abusive because I was in a bad mood sometimes. "Sometimes?" I repeated. He gave a bitter laugh. "You've built this whole grand narrative where I'm some monster and you're this tragic woman escaping oppression." "No," I said, "I built an exit." That landed. He stepped further into the room. "So what? Caleb gets to walk in here like some hero and take your place?" I almost laughed. "He's taking over the lease, Mason, not my identity." Before he could answer, the buzzer rang. His whole face changed. I didn't need him to say anything to know what he was feeling. Dread, pride, irritation, and that desperate wish people have when reality is seconds away from coming through the door and making denial impossible. "I'll get it," I said. By the time I buzzed them in, Dante was grinning at the camera downstairs, one hand raised in greeting. Beside him stood Caleb, broad-shouldered and calm. Next to Caleb was a brunette woman holding a coffee tray. Dante looked up at the speaker. "Tell me you're dressed." I brought caffeine and emotional support. Despite everything, I laughed. "Come up." A minute later, they stepped into the apartment like a gust of normalcy. Dante hugged me first, brief but tight. Caleb gave me a steady smile. "Hey," he said, "you okay?" That simple question, without irritation already built into it, almost undid me. "I'm fine," I said, "really." The woman beside him held out a coffee. "I'm Lena," she said warmly, "Caleb's girlfriend. I volunteered because men doing logistics alone usually turns into theater." Dante pressed a hand to his chest. "That is slander." For the first time in days, the apartment felt inhabited by actual life. Mason visibly hated that. His eyes went to Caleb first, then to Lena, and I recognized the exact second his assumption collapsed. Whatever theory he had built about me, engineering some emotional replacement through the lease transfer, no longer looked nearly as satisfying with Caleb standing there beside an obviously adored girlfriend. "Good. Let him adjust." Dante smiled brightly at Mason. "Morning. Big day." Mason didn't smile back, apparently. Caleb stepped forward and offered his hand. "Thanks again for being flexible about the transfer." Mason looked at the hand for a second too long before shaking it. "Didn't realize I had much choice." "The landlord seemed happy with the paperwork," Caleb said evenly. There was nothing aggressive in his tone, and somehow that made it worse for Mason. Calm, competent men tend to be especially irritating to insecure ones. Lena glanced around. "Cute place." Mason made a dry sound. "Depends what your standards are." Caleb took it in stride. "Good light, decent location, functional kitchen. I've lived with worse." Mason folded his arms. "You may want to lower your expectations further. The hot water cuts out, the neighbors are loud, and the landlord drags his feet on everything." Caleb nodded once. "Good to know. I can work around most of that." Lena sipped her coffee. "And if the landlord drags his feet, I'm very annoying in emails." Dante grinned. "She absolutely is." I saw the flash in Mason's eyes. He was trying to create discomfort and getting teamwork instead. Everything he threw into the room was being absorbed and neutralized before it could do any damage. We walked Caleb through the apartment. I showed him the hall closet, the cabinet with the bad hinge, and the window that stuck when it rained. Mason followed behind us like a shadow that didn't belong to anyone. When we reached what had been my office corner, Caleb took out his phone and measured the wall. "This'll work. Desk can go here. Shelf there." Mason leaned against the doorway. "Hope you like noise. She used to complain every time I had friends over." That was a distortion, not the truth. I had complained when his drunk friends stayed until 2 a.m. on work nights and left bottles on the counter. There's a difference between disliking noise and disliking disrespect. Before I could answer, Lena did. "Most people don't mind guests," she said pleasantly. "They mind cleanup becoming someone else's problem." Dante coughed into his coffee to hide a laugh. Mason's face hardened. "Did Natalie tell you all that?" Caleb looked up. "She didn't have to." The room went quiet. It wasn't even especially harsh, but it carried the kind of truth that lands heavier than shouting. You didn't need a detailed explanation to read the atmosphere. Anyone with emotional eyesight could have walked into that apartment and known exactly who had been doing the carrying. Mason turned to me, anger sharpening his expression. "So that's what this is? You've been telling everyone I'm some useless asshole?" "No," I said, "you've been demonstrating it live." Dante shut his eyes for half a second, like someone trying not to react too visibly to a line that hit exactly where it should. Mason laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Wow, cute. Caleb put his phone away. Look, man, I'm not here for drama. I need a place. She needs out. The landlord approved it, and I'm paying on time. That's the whole story. That's the whole story to you, Mason shot back. Yes, Caleb said. Mason looked from Caleb to Lena, then to me. So what, you all came over here to judge me? Lena raised an eyebrow. I came to help carry boxes and drink coffee. Dante added, I came because she asked me to. That sentence did something to Mason. Maybe because it was so simple. Nobody came because they were trapped. Nobody came because they were being guilted into emotional labor. They came because I mattered enough to be asked. He saw that, I know he did. And instead of letting it humble him, he got meaner. You act like I'm the problem because she can't handle basic conflict. I stepped toward him before anyone else could answer. No, I said quietly. You are the problem because you only call it conflict when I react. When you do it, you call it personality. His eyes locked onto mine. There was real anger there now, but beneath it was something else I had almost forgotten he could feel. Exposure. For months, maybe years, Mason had relied on privacy, on the distortions that happen inside a relationship when only one person gets to define what's real. But the minute other people were in the room, calm people, observant people, people who didn't automatically rearrange themselves around his moods, the whole structure started collapsing. He could feel it slipping, so he changed tactics. He looked at Caleb and said, You know she'll do the same thing to you, right? One day she decides you're not perfect, and suddenly you're the villain in her little memoir. I almost laughed, but Caleb just said, Good thing I'm not dating her. Lena smiled into her coffee. Mason flushed. For one suspended second, he had nowhere to go, no angle, no recovery, just his own pettiness hanging in the air where everyone could see it. Finally, he turned away. I'm done with this. Do whatever you want. He disappeared into the kitchen, opening the refrigerator harder than necessary. Dante let out a low whistle. Well, that went exactly as weird as expected. Lena murmured, honestly, slightly better. Caleb looked at me. Still okay? This time I meant it when I answered. Yes. Not because none of it hurt. Not because the last 3 years had magically become lighter, just because other people could finally see what I had been living with. But because something had shifted in that apartment while Mason failed to hold on to the old story. He no longer looked like the center of my life. He looked like a man standing in the ruins of his own certainty. We went over the final details, key handoff, utility split, what day I'd officially be out, and when Caleb could bring larger furniture. Real practical things. The kind of adult logistics I had handled alone for so long that it startled me to hear them discussed without resistance. Then 3 days later, moving day came. It did not begin with chaos. It began with tension so quiet it felt deliberate. I woke before my alarm, the room half dark, my last morning in that bed sitting heavy in my chest. Not because I was unsure, but because endings, even the right ones, have weight. By the time the movers were supposed to arrive, Dante had already texted, We're downstairs. I replied, Come up. When they walked in, Dante first, then Caleb behind him, already carrying gloves like he'd done this 100 times, the apartment shifted again, just like it had on Saturday. Like Mason's version of reality had no place to stand when other people were around to witness it. Morning, Dante said, scanning the room. You ready? I nodded. Yeah. Caleb gave me a quick look. We'll make it fast. Thank you. From the kitchen, Mason appeared. He looked different. Not softer, not apologetic, just alert, like someone who had finally realized the situation wasn't reversible and didn't like it. You're really doing this today, he said. I picked up a box, handed it to Dante, and answered yes. His jaw flexed. Then, of course, he changed tactics. Well, he said, voice suddenly calmer, almost reasonable. Before you start dragging everything out, we should talk. I set the box down. We already did. No, not properly. There it was. The timing, the recalibration. He had waited until leaving became visible and undeniable, and only now did he want a real conversation. For one brief second, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not hope exactly, but recognition. This was the version of him I had waited for, the one who sounded like he might finally meet me halfway. And it had come now. Of course it had. I think we should go over things, he said, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel private, even with other people in the room. 3 years doesn't just end like this. I looked at him, really looked, at the man I had loved, at the man who had slowly taught me to question whether I was too much for wanting to be treated kindly, at the man who had called our time together lame, and now suddenly wanted to discuss us. Part of me still knew exactly how to respond to that tone. It knew how to soften, how to sit down, how to try one more time. But another voice, quieter, steadier, cut through it. Where was this version of him when you were asking? That question didn't need an answer. I already had it. I'm not doing that, I said. Mason blinked. What? I'm not having a proper conversation now, not when I asked for one over and over again and you dismissed me every time. That's not fair. No, I cut in, calm but firm. What's not fair is waiting until I'm walking out the door to decide I'm worth listening to. The room went still. Behind me, I could feel Dante watching, not stepping in, just witnessing. Mason's expression shifted again. Frustration, disbelief, then anger. You're seriously going to throw everything away without even trying to fix it? I shook my head. I tried. When? For months. That silence was heavy, because now it wasn't just me saying it. Now there were people in the room who had watched him interrupt, dismiss, and deflect. People who knew the difference between conflict and neglect. He could feel that loss of control, so he pushed harder. You're being emotional, he said. You're making a permanent decision based on temporary frustration. I held his gaze. This isn't temporary. You don't know that. I do. You're going to regret this, he snapped. You're going to realize you overreacted, and by then it'll be too late. There it was again, his certainty that I would come back, that I would break before he ever had to. Something in me went very quiet. Move the boxes, I said to Dante. He nodded immediately. Caleb stepped forward and picked up the first stack. Mason looked between us, stunned. You're just going to ignore me? I didn't answer, because that was the point. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't explaining. I wasn't trying to be understood by someone who had already decided not to understand me. I just moved, box by box, step by step, past him, around him, through him, like he wasn't the center of the room anymore. And that broke something. Are you serious right now? He said, voice rising. You're just walking away like none of this matters? I stopped, turned, and looked at him one last time in that space. It mattered, I said quietly. That's why I stayed as long as I did. He froze, not because the words were loud, because they were final. The apartment filled with motion, footsteps, shifting boxes, open doors, brief voices from the hallway. People were here to help me leave, not convince me to stay. Mason stood in the middle of it, losing ground with every box that disappeared out the door. Then he tried one last angle. Remember when we moved in here? He said, voice softer now, almost nostalgic. You said it was our fresh start. I paused, just for a second, because I did remember. I remembered standing in that exact room, laughing, hopeful, believing we were building something together. I also remembered him calling that memory cheesy just a month earlier. I remember, I said. So how can you just throw that away? I met his eyes. I'm not, I said. You already did. That was the moment he stopped trying to sound reasonable. His expression hardened completely. You're a coward, he said. Real relationships don't end like this. I didn't flinch. Real relationships don't look like what we had. That landed harder than anything else I had said, because it wasn't emotional or dramatic. It was simply true. And truth, stripped clean, leaves nowhere to hide. The last box went out. Dante clapped his hands once. That's everything. Caleb nodded towards the door. Truck's ready. I picked up my bag, the last thing I had left in that apartment, and walked toward the door. Mason didn't move, didn't block me, didn't reach out. He just stood there watching as I passed him, stepped into the hallway, and left behind the version of myself that had once believed love meant enduring anything. Just before I turned the corner, I heard his voice, quieter than before. Natalie, wait. I didn't stop, because I already knew what he was going to say. And for the first time, I didn't need to hear it. I thought the silence would feel like freedom the second I walked out. It didn't. Not right away. It felt strange, like stepping into a space where no one was watching, judging, or waiting for me to say the wrong thing, and not quite knowing what to do with that kind of quiet yet. The drive to my new place was short. Dante talked the entire time. Traffic, one of the movers looking like a retired wrestler, how he was absolutely claiming my couch the next time he visited. I let him. He wasn't trying to distract me. He was trying to keep the moment from collapsing under its own weight. When we finally pulled up to my new apartment, a small studio on the 3rd floor, nothing fancy, slightly too bright in the afternoon sun, I stood there for a second with the keys in my hand. Door in front of me. No Mason inside. No version of myself waiting to be smaller. Just space. Go on, Dante said gently behind me. I unlocked the door and stepped in. It smelled like fresh paint and something faintly metallic, like it hadn't really been lived in yet. The windows were bigger than I remembered. The kitchen was small but clean. The light hit the floor in a way that made everything feel open. Mine. For the first time in a very long time, mine. I didn't cry. I just exhaled, long and slow, like I had been holding my breath for months and hadn't realized it until that exact second. Dante leaned against the doorframe. Okay? I nodded. Yeah, I think I am. Caleb and Lena carried the last few boxes in and set them down without turning it into something heavier than it needed to be. That's the last of it, Caleb said. Call if you need help setting anything up, Lena added, or if you just want company that doesn't roll its eyes at you. That made me smile. Thank you. Because they hadn't just helped me move. They had witnessed the leaving, and that mattered more than I could explain. After they left, after Dante lingered just long enough to make sure I wasn't about to spiral and then finally headed out with a warning that he would show up uninvited if I didn't text later, the apartment went quiet. Really quiet. I stood in the middle of it. No TV in the background. No sighs. No tension pressing into the walls. Just stillness. I walked to the window, looked out at a street I didn't know yet, and for the first time in months, I felt lighter. Not fully happy. Not yet, but lighter. That feeling lasted about 2 hours. Then my phone started lighting up. Mason. Of course. The dishwasher is leaking. I stared at the message and didn't respond. Another one came. Where did you put the wrench? Then, why isn't the streaming working? I let out a breath that was half a laugh. There it was. Not I miss you, not I'm sorry, not can we talk. Just problems. Logistics. The invisible labor I had taken with me when I left. 5 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. Seriously, Natalie, the water is everywhere. I picked it up, typed, stopped, deleted, then typed again. Call the landlord. Simple, neutral, the exact kind of answer he had given me every time I asked for help. I hit send. 3 dots appeared immediately. I don't have time for this right now. I stared at that message for a second. Then I laughed. Actually laughed. Because the symmetry was almost too perfect. I didn't respond again. Instead, I opened one of the boxes and started unpacking. Plate by plate, book by book, rebuilding a life that only had to hold me. The messages kept coming. This is your responsibility too. You can't just disappear like this. We're not even officially broken up. That one made me pause. I picked up the phone again, read it twice, then typed back. We are. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned the phone off. Because for the first time, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to before. Closure is not something the other person gives you. It is something you take when you decide you're done explaining. Later that evening, I turned my phone back on. Not because I was ready to talk, just because I was curious. There were more messages, but not from Mason. From Bianca. Of course. I opened the first one. What the hell did you do to him? Then another. He's a mess. You completely blindsided him. I leaned back against the counter and read that again. Blindsided. That word again. The narrative was already forming in real time. Poor Mason. Left out of nowhere. No warning. No explanation. Just cruelty. I typed slowly. I didn't blindside him. I stopped accepting being treated badly. 3 dots appeared. Then, you're exaggerating. He's not perfect, but no one is. I smiled faintly. There it was. Minimization. The easiest way to dismiss someone's experience is to downgrade it into something everyone should tolerate. This isn't about perfection, I replied. It's about basic respect. The response came fast. He loved you. You were just too much work. That one sat there for a second. Not because it hurt, because it used to. At some point, I had believed that. That love was something you earned by being easy enough to keep. I looked around my apartment, at the quiet, the space, the absence of someone measuring my worth by how little I asked for, then typed back, "If love feels like work, you're doing it wrong." There was no reply after that. That night, I made dinner. The same salmon. The same quinoa. No candle, no performance, just food. I sat at my small table, took a bite, and waited for the familiar feeling. The one where I braced for judgment, for the comment, for the sigh. It didn't come. Of course it didn't, because I was alone. And for the first time, alone didn't feel like rejection. It felt like peace. I washed my plate, turned on a documentary about whales, and let it play while I folded clothes. No one rolled their eyes. No one called it boring. No one made me feel like I had to justify what I enjoyed. It was such a small thing, but it felt enormous. Before bed, my phone buzzed one more time. A message from Dante. Proud of you. I stared at it, then typed back. I think I'm starting to understand why. Because this wasn't just about leaving Mason. It was about leaving the version of myself who thought staying was the stronger choice. I lay down in a bed that was only mine, in a room with no tension, no expectations, no quiet resentment waiting to surface. And just before I fell asleep, one thought settled clearly into place. He thought I needed someone else to leave him. He never considered that I might just need myself. 2 weeks later, I ran into Mason. Not at a party, not at a mutual friend's place, just on a Saturday morning at a farmer's market. The kind of place that used to feel like effort when I was with him. Too slow, too quiet, too full of people enjoying things without apologizing for it. Now it felt easy. I was standing near a stall with fresh herbs, laughing about something I barely remember when I heard my name. Natalie. I turned, and there he was. Mason, standing a few feet away, like he had been dropped into a version of my life that no longer had space for him. For a second, neither of us spoke, because something had already changed. It wasn't just that I had left. It was that I no longer felt pulled toward him. His eyes moved first, not to my face, to my hand, and then to the hand I was holding. Elias. He stood beside me, relaxed, grounded, completely unaware that this exact kind of moment used to terrify me. Once, I would have worried about how it looked, about whether it seemed too fast, too cold, too easy for Mason to weaponize. Now I just stood there, present. Elias squeezed my hand gently. You okay? I nodded. Yeah. Then I looked back at Mason. This is Elias. Elias stepped forward naturally, offering a hand. Hey. Mason didn't take it. Of course he didn't. He just stared and asked, how long? No greeting, no acknowledgement, just accusation wrapped in curiosity. I didn't hesitate. About a week. His expression shifted instantly. A week? You moved out 2 weeks ago. Yes, and you're already with someone else. I tilted my head slightly. There it was again. His assumption that I had replaced him, that this moment was somehow still about him. Elias glanced between us, catching the tone and the history. I'm sorry, he said calmly. You are? Natalie's ex, I answered before Mason could. Elias nodded once. Got it. Mason looked back at me. So that's it? You just walk out and replace me like I was nothing? I didn't replace you, I said. I left you. That's the same thing. No, I said quietly. It's not. Silence stretched between us. Behind Mason, I noticed Bianca standing a few steps back, watching like she was waiting for a scene to unfold. Of course she was there too. Of course she was still orbiting him, still feeding that version of reality where I had done something unforgivable by refusing to stay. Elias shifted slightly closer to me. Not performative, not territorial, just there. Steady. Grounded. Everything Mason had spent the last year pretending to be. Mason let out a short laugh. Unbelievable. What is? I asked. You, he said. All of this. You planned it. I almost smiled. I planned to leave someone who treated me badly. Everything after that just happened. Bianca stepped forward, unable to stay quiet any longer. This is so disrespectful. Parading him around like this? I looked at her. We're buying vegetables. Elias let out a breath that might have been a laugh. Mason's jaw tightened. You really think this is going to last? I glanced at Elias, then back at Mason. I don't know, I said honestly. That seemed to throw him off more than anything else. But I know this, I continued. It already feels better than what I had with you. That landed hard, because it wasn't cruel. It was simple. And simple truths are the hardest to argue with. Bianca scoffed. He's not even that special. Elias looked at her and smiled faintly. I'm okay with that. I squeezed his hand lightly, not for show, just because I wanted to. Mason watched that, really watched it, and I could see the realization arriving. Not the loud kind, not the explosive kind, but the quiet one that comes when you finally understand something too late to fix it. He looked at me differently. Like he was trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the version he had gotten used to. The one who stayed, explained, absorbed, and adjusted. That version was gone. You're happier, he said, almost to himself. I didn't answer right away because that question deserved honesty. And honesty now was something I no longer diluted. Yes, I said, just one word. But it changed everything, because it confirmed what he had been trying not to see. That I hadn't just left him. I had become someone he no longer had access to. He looked down, then up, then away again, like there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make him feel smaller than he already did. Whatever, he muttered. But it didn't sound convincing. Bianca touched his arm. Come on. He didn't move immediately. For a second, I thought he might try one last time, one more argument, one more attempt to pull me back into a conversation that no longer belonged to him. But he didn't. He just nodded once, turned, and walked away. Just like I had. The difference was, I had known where I was going. Elias looked down at me. You good? I exhaled slowly, watched Mason disappear into the crowd, and felt nothing pull after him. I'm good, I said, and I meant it. We finished shopping, bought things I liked, things I didn't have to justify. That night we cooked together. Nothing complicated, just stir-fry, soft music in the background, and conversation that didn't feel like work. At one point, Elias handed me a spoon and said, "Taste this. Tell me if it needs anything." I did. "It's good," I said. "Just good?" he teased. I smiled. "Okay, it's really good." He grinned. "Better." And just like that, it was easy. No tension. No performance. No quiet fear that I was about to be dismissed for speaking. Later, my phone buzzed. A message from Dante. "Saw Mason today. He looks like he lost a bet with life." I laughed softly and typed back. "He lost something." I didn't explain. I didn't need to, because the truth was simple. Mason thought telling me to find someone else was a threat, a way to remind me that I could be replaced. What he didn't understand was that it gave me permission. Permission to walk away. Permission to remember what being valued feels like. Permission to build a life where I don't have to earn basic kindness. And in the end, I didn't just find someone else. I found myself again.